Thanks for joining our second Coffee Night speaker series, where we're joined by an expert from one of the nation's leading research organizations. My name is Ibrahim Manli. I'm the executive director of Rumi Forum. I'll be moderating the event this evening, and we express our heartfelt thanks to Baxter Oliphant, senior researcher at Pew Research, who is going to be our speaker this evening and talk about Americans immersed in COVID-19 news, the ongoing coverage, and how public opinion is reflecting on it. Baxter Oliphant is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center, where he focuses on US politics and policy research, including partisan polarization, trust in government, gun policy, and US foreign policy. He received doctoral and master's degrees in politics from Princeton University and holds a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University. His dissertation explored the impact of moral judgments on US presidential elections. Before graduate school, he worked in political polling for campaigns and industry groups. Oliphant is a member of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the American Political Science Association. So all participants, as a side note, all participants will be muted. Please write your questions to the chat box, and after the presentation, we will share them with our speaker during the Q&A. So Baxter, thanks again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this evening to share some of the research that we have been doing at the Pew Research Center, centered around the coronavirus outbreak. And I will be sharing, sorry, I'm hiding the video so that I can focus on the slides. I hope you all can see me here. So I'm going to be sharing some research that others and I have worked on over the last month since things shut down. This is my first presentation over Zoom, so it's a new experience. Lots of jokes though about how, since you can only see the top half of me, that I could have anything on. I'll say it's nice. I have fuzzy slippers on. That's a good way to give a presentation. I might have to make it my normal habit. So first, just a quick introduction. If I can get my slides to advance. Here we go, to the Pew Research Center. We are a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about a variety of issues and attitudes, both in the United States and around the world. We focus on public opinion polling, but we also do demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science. You can see a list here of the areas in which we do our research. So if you're interested in any of those, I really encourage you to follow us on Twitter if you're on Twitter, or visit our website, pewresearch.org. Everything that we publish is there. It's available free to anyone who can use it. And I really encourage you to take advantage of it, because there's so much there beyond what I'll talk about tonight. What I'll talk about tonight is data that has been collected as part of the Election News Pathways Project. This is a new ongoing research initiative focusing on news habits and attitudes related to the 2020 presidential election. But since COVID has arrived on the scene and really dominated what's been going on, even overshadowing a presidential election, we've been focusing on that as well, to see what Americans think about how the news media is doing, how closely they're following the news about this, among other topics. And so tonight, I'll be talking primarily about results from a survey that we conducted March 10th through 16th last month. So this is a fast-moving story, things have potentially changed since we collected this data. We hope to revisit many of the topics I'll talk about tonight soon in new surveys. So again, I encourage you to follow us, visit our website to see what we do. But in March, 10th through 16th, this was right around when schools were starting to close in some states. March 13th is when the president announced the national state of emergency. So that it was really when things were starting to get going and lockdowns announced. And so we conducted this survey on the American Trends Panel, which is our own nationally representative survey panel where we conduct surveys online, but we've recruited the participants to be representative of the US population overall. And we asked them how closely they are following news about COVID-19, as well as a number of follow-up questions focused on what they think the media is doing and what they know about some of the details of the outbreak. And what we found, as you can see here, is that the public is overwhelmingly engaged with this news story. 89% of US adults told us that they are following this story very or fairly closely. That is much higher than we find for a lot of other topics. A few months ago, we asked how closely people had followed the impeachment process, and it was significantly lower than this. So that's the first thing to take away from here, is that the public is engaged with this news story. It's a huge story. It's probably comparable in our lifetime, in my lifetime, to 9/11 only, and even then, since this is an ongoing, evolving, potentially getting worse every day, we'll have to see what happens in the future. And so the public's engaged, and they think generally the media is doing at least somewhat well covering the story. So in the second row there, you can see that 70% of the public thinks the media have covered the COVID-19 and coronavirus outbreak at least somewhat well. And I'll dig into, but beyond these numbers, there are some differences. So here are the numbers on the share of US adults who are following the story very fairly or less closely. And you can see that Republicans and Democrats in the shares that are following very closely or fairly closely are basically the same. But Democrats are a little bit more engaged, where 53% of Democrats and independents who lean toward the Democratic Party say that they're following very closely, compared to 48% of Republicans and independents who lean towards the Republican Party are following closely. So Democrats a little bit more engaged, but even more in the bottom four rows there, you can see that by age makes a big difference in the attention Americans are giving to this topic. This is all adults ages 18 to 29. We can see 40% say they're following this news story very closely. It goes up almost like steps from there, and maxing out of Americans ages 65 and older, 2/3 of them are following this story very closely. This pattern matches what we find on other topics. Generally, older adults are paying more closely attention. They're more engaged with the news, and we see that pattern repeating here. Additionally, there are other gaps more related to politics. The top row here shows the percent of Republicans and Democrats, and as I just mentioned previously, essentially no difference in the share that are following news about the outbreak very or fairly closely. But there are some gaps between Republicans and Democrats in how they rate the news media, how well it's been doing overall. And we also asked them to rate how their own news sources have covered the outbreak. And on both of those questions, Democrats rate the media more highly than Republicans. And particularly what I'll focus on the most moving forward will be this question here, this 21-point gap in the share of Republicans and Democrats who say the media is covering this outbreak at least somewhat well. But that's not the only difference. So there's a party difference, but also the age difference that I mentioned earlier is still present here as well. So younger adults, particularly those who are ages 18 to 29, they're following the story less closely, as we talked about a couple slides ago. And also, this slide reports that they rate the media's performance less positively. They're not negative. Only about 40% of those younger adults say the media is either doing not well at all or not too well. Most of them say the media is doing at least somewhat well, but it is much lower for the news media overall, but also for their own news sources. And particularly, the darker on the right side of the screen, where the very well, it's almost double the share of adults ages 65 plus who say the media is doing very well than the adults under 30. So the same pattern, but very interesting to see that young people, they're less engaged with the story, they're less satisfied with, they rate the media's performance lower. Now, so far I've been sharing data from a survey conducted March 10th through 16th that was more focused on media. There was another survey that we did at the Pew Research Center focused more on the political issues, but it had one question about the news media. And so this is a different question. Previously, we asked, how well is the media covering this? This new question, it was a battery of questions where there were different entities that you'll see here on screen, where we asked for each one of these whether the public thought they were doing an excellent or good. We had more negative ratings, but we'll focus just on those two more positive. Job responding to the coronavirus outbreak. So you see we had the CD, public health officials, state elected officials, local people in the community, the news media, and Donald Trump. So this is a different question. And on this different question, overall, 54% of the public here in the second to bottom row thought the media was doing it excellent or good. Big partisan gap as well, as we saw in the previous question. Because these questions are different, though, they're not directly comparable. We can't say that the public is less satisfied now with how well the media is covering this. It's just a different question, different context, not directly comparable. We will revisit that question that we were previously talking about in surveys soon, and we'll be able to find out how the media ratings might be changing, if at all. But this question was very interesting because we were able to analyze it by the platform that people get their news from. So along the y-axis, the vertical axis here, we asked a question last fall. We did a survey measuring these respondents' media habits and attitudes, where they go to get their news. And one of the questions is where people prefer to go. And we gave these options if they prefer to watch it on network TV, print, local, cable, etc. So that's breaking up these respondents by which platform they go to most often. And we can see here that the platform makes a difference. It is connected to how well people think the media is doing covering the coronavirus outbreak. Those who say their most common platform is network TV or print, about 2/3 of them say the media is doing at least a good job. 20% say they're doing an excellent job. And then that falls from there significantly down to the respondents who said they got most of their political and election news from the radio or social media, where they're actually more are saying they think the media is doing a poor or only a fair job. So where people are going, what they're seeing. Now, we can't say that this is causing, that like going to social media causes you. There's a lot going on, lots of variables we can't speak to. But it does show that the types of people who get their news in these different places are giving the media different ratings. They are more critical in some places than elsewhere. Also, this question finds very interesting age differences. I'm really hitting this age difference because this has been a big part of the coronavirus outbreak, where there have been some accusations that young people don't take it as seriously. They definitely, our surveys have found they don't think it's a threat to them and their health, though they do think it's a threat to the countries. And we find here that it's similar on how well they think the media is responding. So this is the percent who say the news media are doing an excellent or good job at responding to the outbreak. And it breaks up the age categories by whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And what's very, very interesting here is that among Republicans, there's not a lot of variance. There's not a lot of change, but among Democrats, which are the majority of young adults ages 18 to 29, they're much less positive about the media's performance than older Democrats. You know, Democrats ages 65 and over, 89%, more than double the 42% of Democrats ages 18 to 29 who say the media is doing at least a good job. And part of this might tie, I mean, again, this can tie to a lot of different things, but it still is very interesting to see here that age makes a big difference in how well people think the media is doing. Now, back on the survey in mid-March, March 10th through 16th, we also asked a battery of questions. We asked the same question about a lot of different 4 different groups, but I'm just going to report the media here. We asked whether people thought the media, the news media, was exaggerating the risks, either greatly or slightly, whether they got the risks about right or not taking the risks quite seriously enough or seriously at all. Really want to draw your attention to the big chunk of the exaggerated risk. 37% of the public said the media was exaggerating in mid-March the risks of the outbreak. 25% said they were slightly exaggerating. You know, those two together are the majority of the public, a bit over 60%, while only 30% thought the media at the time was getting the risks about right. Far fewer thought the media wasn't taking it seriously enough, less than 10%. This has similar divisions as we've seen along political variables. It was overwhelmingly the attitude among Republicans that the media was exaggerating the risks. About half, 53% of Republicans and Republican leaners thought the media was exaggerating. Compared, you know, so 53% of Republicans compared to 22% of Democrats. You know, really, but, you know, over twice as many Republicans say they're greatly exaggerating risks. While Democrats, they too, you know, it wasn't unheard of, you know, almost half, about half, I should say, thought the media was exaggerating, which more than the Democrats who thought the risks were about right in the media coverage at the time. And this also correlates with where people get their news. Now, this slide I just put up is a little confusing. So give me a moment to explain it. The categories along the vertical axis here are categories that we created that record where people go to get their news, where our respondents go to get their news. We classified the outlets. So last fall, we did this survey where we asked a lot of questions about where people get their news, what their attitudes about the news, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the questions we asked is we gave them a list of 30 outlets, news outlets, designed to be representative as best as we could do. You know, couldn't get everything on a list in a survey. It would be too long, too many places to get news. But we chose 30 outlets that were pretty representative of the overall news environment. And then we coded those outlets according to their audiences. So you can see here, that we have these categories of like only outlets with right-leaning audiences, only outlets with left-leaning audiences. So we categorize them by the percentage of our respondents who were either liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans who said they went to each of these outlets, to give kind of the outlets like a score of what their audience's political leanings were. Then we grouped them into these categories, and we coded Republicans and Democrats on whether they're going to outlets. So the top in each for the Republicans, the top for the Democrats, these two are showing the Republicans on top and then the Democrats, the lower highlighted in red here, that only get news from outlets where the audiences lean in the direction of their party. So this is Republicans who only get news from right-leaning outlets, Democrats who only get news from left-leaning audiences, outlets, actually, excuse me. The outlets themselves can be any direction. This is just the audiences. And what stands out here is that among Democrats, lesser so among Republicans, lesser so among Democrats, where people get their news correlates quite a bit with whether they thought the media was exaggerating the risks of the coronavirus in March. So this top category that's highlighted here, Republicans who got news from only outlets with right-leaning audiences. So this means people who are only going to places like Fox News, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Rush Limbaugh. We had 6 outlets. Those are a few of them. They're much more likely, 63% of them said the media was greatly exaggerating the risk, which is much more than any of those other 2 categories of Republicans. We see something not quite as dramatic, but there's still some differences there among Democrats who got news only from outlets that are left-leaning audiences. So that's like MSNBC, the New York Times, NPR. That category is slightly more likely than other Democrats to say the media was exaggerating the risks, and then slightly less likely than other Democrats to say they gotten it about right. So where, again, we got to be careful. We can't say this is causing things, but it does correlate very interestingly with these patterns. Now, to move on from just the attitudes about how the media is doing, we've also looked at what people know about a few elements of the outbreak. We've asked a few different questions that are based on knowledge. I'm just going to focus on one. We've asked others about the availability of a vaccine. But this one asks what people thought was the most likely origin of the virus. And here the vertical lists the response options that we gave people on the survey. And we see the biggest group of Americans do think COVID-19 came about naturally. But there's still a significant share, about 3 in 10, who think it was created either intentionally or made accidentally in a lab. But a quarter said they're not sure. Again, I'll emphasize, this was a month ago. A lot, scientists are very confident that this was not a bioengineered virus, but there has been news breaking that the first transmissions might have involved a lab. So this is just what people thought was most likely. And the plurality here agrees with the expert consensus that it came about naturally, but there are some differences. This graphic is showing the response options I just showed you. We dropped the one about it doesn't really exist because so few people chose that. And what really is very interesting here is the partisan differences. Republicans less likely to think it came about naturally than Democrats. About half of Democrats say it probably came about likely compared to a bit more than a third of Republicans. On the other hand, Republicans much more likely to say it was developed intentionally in a lab. 30% of Republicans say that compared to just 16% of Democrats. And if we focus just on kind of the most ideological in each party, these differences grow. So conservative Republicans, 31% of them think that this virus was most likely developed intentionally in a lab at the time, and where liberal Democrats are on the other side of the coin. Nearly 2/3 of them say it most likely came about naturally. This may, and again, what I'd like to emphasize, this may have changed since this was at the very early days of the outbreak, but it is very interesting to see that these different groups were processing and had different views of what was likely to be the cause behind it. And now I'll revisit these news diet variables that I just explained earlier. And if you want more details, they're on our website, and I can share a link potentially if anybody really wants to say. It's a very involved process of how we code these, but we see something similar here, as I showed earlier, that where Republicans and Democrats are getting their news based on the audiences of those outlets that they go to correlates with their views of the virus. So the Republicans who got news from only outlets with right-leaning audiences, 40% of them say it's most likely COVID-19, the virus that causes it, was developed intentionally in a lab. But on the other hand, among Democrats, the Democrats who only got news from outlets with audiences that lean their direction, so left-leaning audiences, it's only 13% who say developed intentionally in a lab, where 61% of these Democrats say that it probably, most likely came about naturally. Oh yes, I forgot I had the highlights there. Now, a few last slides in the last few minutes here is we've also started to explore what Americans are experiencing around misinformation and even disinformation around the coronavirus outbreak, excuse me. And so in March, this is the same survey conducted March 10th through 16th, so fairly early on in the quarantine period when things were starting to shut down. We asked our respondents if they had seen anything that seemed to them to have been completely made up. And we gave them the choice to say a lot, some, not I forget exactly, or none at all. And 48% said at least some made up news or information about the outbreak. This shows in more detail the distribution of what people were saying. So 12% of the public, in the top right pie wedge, I guess we call that in pie charts. So 12% said they'd seen a lot. 35% said some. And you can see we sum that up to 48%. You might be wondering if we know how to do math. That's because of rounding. So like it's 12 point something, 35 point something. And then when you put those together, it rounds to 48% say they've seen at least some made up news. So about half. The other half of the country say they've seen either not much or none at all. And what's interesting, as you see at the bottom here, is there is a slight partisan difference that Republicans are somewhat more likely than Democrats to say they've seen at least some made up news and information. So 14% of Republicans say they've seen a lot. 39% of Republicans say they've seen some, and that compares with just 10% of Democrats saying they've seen some versus 32% of Democrats who've seen some, or a lot, excuse me, for the 10. And what's very interesting about this is your first thought is, well, what are they seeing and what are they, because this is people reporting their own thoughts and their own impressions. And so we did ask a an open-ended question where people could enter in, and we asked, what did you see that that seemed completely made up? And we have been coding that, and we'll be releasing the results very shortly, soon. So again, I encourage you to follow Pew Research, visit our website, that'll be out soon, because it is interesting to see. It's not ready. I really wished it was that it had been ready and checked to go for this presentation, but not quite. And so we'll have that soon. Now, finally, I want to share with everybody, if you're interested in this, we have a data tool at the Pew Research Center where the link is there on the screen at the bottom, where we are posting all of this data. Everything that I've showed, all of these survey questions are now in this data tool. And you can go there. It's completely free and available to anyone who's interested. And look up these questions. We have a bunch of questions about the coronavirus, but also some from previously about the impeachment, about other political matters, about news attitudes, that you can then analyze by a lot of different breaks that I've been sharing here tonight. And this actually right here shows that we asked again on the March 19th to the 24th survey, kind of late-ish March. We updated the how closely are you following news about the outbreak. So these numbers are different than what I showed, and it had gone up a little bit. We have more in-depth analysis about exactly who is changing, who is more engaged after that period than others. Starting to run into where just everybody is engaged and very, very few people, not shown on the screen, cut off on the right there, say they're not following it, but it went up. And just from mid-March to kind of late March, the share of the public following it went up. Who that was, we're right now putting together a report to look at who exactly it was. So thank you so much, everyone, for it's been a pleasure to share this data with all of you. Again, here is the website for the Pew Research Center. All of this is available in reports there. We are tracking very closely the public's reaction, the implications, the consequences of this global pandemic on US public opinion, both for their attitudes about the media, politics, economics, inequality, race relations, all of those things. Science. We're planning on looking at all of those over the next months and beyond. And so I encourage you to join us and follow along and read more about the research that will be put out by myself, those I work with, but also teams all around the Pew Research Center. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Baxter. So you started your introduction by reminding us that Pew Research is a fact tank, and you definitely live up to the phrase. That's very clear. So we have a number of questions already popping up on our chat screen. I'll begin with the first one. One of our participants, Mustafa, asks, do you have a data for ages 18 to 29, how closely they follow news in general, assuming they are not following the news in general as much as the older people?
Yes, I do. I'll have to apologize. I don't remember the numbers right off the top of my head, but yeah, we have found my colleagues that are experts in this even a bit more than I am, who study people's news consumption. That is a consistent finding that young people, they are less engaged with the news. I mean, they're less about a lot of things that we measure. They're less likely to vote. They're less likely even to take surveys. They're very difficult to recruit. We've got to work really hard to get them to take our surveys. And so this is a continuation of the pattern, but they are higher than they generally are. Like they are, for young people, they're paying attention to this story, but they just haven't caught up to the older adults. And I mentioned that we're working on an additional report that we hope to have out soon, where we asked how closely they were following it twice and among the same people, and we're going to look to see if they're catching up or if they're just, that was as engaged as they're going to get. Unfortunately, we don't have those results yet.
Thank you. We have another question from again from someone.
That's from Ruth. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This
Please
is
go
Ruth.
ahead.
I on page, I think it must have been on slide 19 maybe, where you were talking about slide 19. Let me just a second. Go back one more. Go back one, this one right here, that one. So where you show, it just seemed interesting to me that those Republicans and leaning Republicans who only listen to outlets without right-leaning audiences, and those Dems and leaning Dems who only listen to outlets without left-leaning were closer. In fact, they were even surprisingly a little bit different. So just reminds me that that where we get our media really affects what we're thinking, and that those that are more neutral, and I don't know what those are. I'd like to know what outlets are considered sort of neutral. Any comments on that, those numbers?
Yes. There's a lot going on here. Impressive table, your graphics reading to pick up on this. Yeah, so the more neutral, I don't want to call them neutral. It's just the kind of the outlets with mixed audiences. So so for example, for the Republicans here, Republicans who got news from only outlets without right-leaning audiences, it means they either went to mixed audience outlets or left-leaning audience. So it could be a Republican. So our mixed outlets, I'm not going to remember all of them off the top of my head. So like the Wall Street Journal has a mixed political audience. Neither conservative Republicans nor liberal Democrats dominate in the audience like they might in other outlets. The New York Post is also in that category. The major broadcast news are in that mixed audience category. So the Republicans or the Democrats who are only going to these more mixed, or they could be going to the outlet that aligns, so to speak, the audience with the other side. There are Republicans who only go to NPR and New York Times, for example. And there are Democrats who only go to Fox News or things like that. That group, there is less of a gap. We find this in a lot of studies in politics, that there's almost like a U shape in attitudes that however you might consider the most committed, whether it's ideology or giving money or whatever it might, however you measure the most committed Republicans and Democrats, they're often the farthest apart, and things often move together in the middle. And we see that here. Part of the reason for this, the data we have can't speak to like why exactly that's happened. We can't get into causal. But one thing that is interesting about that group of those who only get news from places that don't have audiences that align with their party, they often tend to be a little bit less newsy, so to speak, than others. They go to fewer outlets overall. They're less likely to follow the news very closely, regardless of the topic. This is just news in general. So that might explain what's going on here. These are people who just aren't paying as much attention, so they hadn't gotten kind of which side the parties seem to be lining up with. In early March, as things started getting going, so to speak, on this outbreak. And so that does, this is a pattern we see where the groups that are a little less polarized do tend to converge a bit. They're not exactly like, that 44% who say came about naturally among Republicans who only got news from outlets without right-leaning audiences, versus the Democrats who are only getting from outlets without left-leaning audiences. That's probably a significant gap. So here we see the Republicans who are more likely than certain Democrats to give the response that experts support that it came about naturally.
Thank you. We have another question from another participant of ours named Mustafa again. Would you study people not accusing China for not making full disclosure from beginning? What are the findings about that?
It's an excellent question, and I have to confess we haven't asked that yet, but we plan on it. We have a number of teams around the Pew Research Center that are interested in that question. But we did have a report that gets at that a little bit today, that looked at how people rate different threats to the security of the United States. This was asked, it was a battery, just given lots of different, but one of the items was the spread of disease, and that unsurprisingly has gone up. But another item that they asked, it wasn't connected directly to the COVID outbreak, so I can't speak to whether people blame them or what they think about it, but it continues a trend today where the share of the public, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, so excuse me, I won't have those facts to give you, but I can tell you the pattern. Those have been going up. The share of US adults that say China is a threat to the United States has been going up, and I forget the last time we'd asked that question, but this most recent time that we asked, right as the COVID breakout was getting going, was up. And I'm plugging our website and our Twitter. Give us a follow. We will have more to say about this in months to come as we have the chance to survey about what people think about China and this outbreak.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You let me abuse my seat a little bit and direct a question myself. You told at the beginning this has received incomparably higher interest to many other high topics, including the impeachment, and then you talked about some sub-trends. One was how conspirational attitudes dominate, and it looks like 1/3 of the population believe that was deliberately generated in a laboratory setting. So how does that compare with other conspirational stories or other conspirational versions of real stories?
Yeah. That is an excellent question. And again, I have to say, we haven't done that analysis yet. Mm-hmm. It's funny you bring this up because I was actually just speaking with some coworkers, some colleagues today that we want to look at that. We haven't looked at it yet. I don't know off the top of my head, so I won't put any numbers to it. So I don't know if that's higher or lower. We will find out. Because we do plan on looking, because we had the exact same question. is, you know, it's pretty significant, but COVID-19 has had a lot of misinformation. At least that's the impression I have. We haven't measured it. But, you know, it does seem to be a lot going on out there and conflicting stories. But there's a lot of that all the time, which is a good point. And so we do plan on looking back in questions we previously asked, asking new questions if we need to compare that. We do plan on doing that, but we don't have an answer yet.
And I have another question about how conventional media rates with the new generation medium. So those who follow conventional media seem to be better satisfied, whereas this new generation channels are not. So that is kind of disproportional with the success of the new media. So is that a pattern that we see in other issues?
It's definitely a pattern we've seen on the coronavirus and things related to this. I don't have slides. I wish I could show it to you. We wrote a report as part of the Pathways, Election News Pathways project a few weeks ago, where we specifically pulled out this social media group on the bottom here on screen. We pulled them out to just look at what they were thinking, and they were quite different. They weren't always different. So sometimes social media, the people who say that's where they get their main platform, were very similar to local TV folks, the people who are watching, you know, the kind of 6 o'clock news before the big national broadcasts. To say exactly what's going on there, we don't have enough data yet. It could correlate with a lot of things. So, you know, sometimes people say, oh, well, social media, that's young people. And young people are just kind of, they want to be cool, they want to be cynical, nothing's great, nothing's awful, you know, so they give, and young people do, you know, as we've been talking about, they're different. They do often tend to give slightly lower ratings for, you know, things like that. And part of that, because they're not paying attention. So when you're not paying attention, you kind of give a middling rating. And so sometimes the temptation is to always think social media, that's a difference because it's just a bunch of young people. Young people are different. They're also very racially and ethnically diverse, this latest young generation. But we have looked at that, and that's not always the case. There does seem to be something. What exactly it is, we're studying, and I won't speculate it to be. But the platform where people, whatever it is, do seem to often interpret the news, incorporate it, learn about it just slightly differently. What exactly is going on? I mean, there's like, I'm sure there's whole dissertations that people could write about that, books to write about it. But we will be looking into that as we move forward, because that's one of the research topics we're interested in, how these different places that people get news are impacting what they're thinking. What exactly it is especially with survey data, it's really hard to pin down. But it does seem to be just a different group of people. And I mean, I could get into a whole new presentation where we talk about the differences between where, you know, the types of people who go to different outlets, different types of places where they like to get the news. And there's a lot of differences going on here that need study and exploration.
You had another chart. We have a question about it that compares the presidential approval rates being at the very bottom to COVID-19 yes. So can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah. Well, what you can see in a lot of ways is the rating, the 48% there in the total column for Donald Trump, in the share that say he's doing excellent or good, it's really a product of partisan polarization. He has not been able to escape that, at least so far. These other ratings, the four on top, and to a lesser extent, the news media, there's not that gap between Republicans and Democrats. And so with Trump, we see here that 83% of Republicans and Republican leaners say he's doing at least a good job, which is about the same as Republicans saying that public health officials are doing a good job. You know, so they really think he's doing a good job. They're behind him. Democrats are not, in a way that they've not been behind him throughout his whole presidency. This has been something that we have looked at, but also others, in that, you know, as political scientists call it, the rally around the flag effect. Often when there's a big national event, people rally to the president to say that he's been doing a good job, to push the country forward. It feels patriotic. It happened after 9/11, when George W. Bush and his presidential approval was through the roof. It has not happened for COVID-19. It continues. The Pew Research Center, we've got some publications where we've looked, and others have done this too. Others have confirmed this work, and we've confirmed their work, that Trump has been the most polarized so far through his presidency, and this issue is basically the same. When it first arrived and we first started doing these surveys, we were fielding them very curious to see if partisan attitudes might shake a little bit related to this, because it's such a big story. It's unprecedented in modern American history. We're still looking at that, but so far what we've seen is what you see here, is that it's still very, very polarized. Democrats, they say he has not been doing a good job. Republicans say he has, and that is a lot of what is going on for why he's at the bottom there. And it's similar to why the media is near the bottom there, similar gap. Democrats say the media is, majority of them say he's been doing at least a good job. Only about a third of Republicans agreed for the media. So it's polarization really is doing a lot of driving both of those down to the bottom of that list.
And I turn the audience to see whether we have any other questions. Before I ask one last one, which is those strikingly different internal variations within the Democratic constituency and absence thereof within the Republicans. So yes, that's huge. So can you help us understand this better a little bit?
I don't want to speculate here. We haven't looked at everything here, so I don't know exactly what's going on. Younger Democrats, they do sometimes on other issues, not always though. Not all. Like, this is pretty interesting. I cannot say why they're so low. I mean, it's potentially they're all mad that their spring break plans were canceled. It could be, I mean, that's speculation. I just don't know. We don't know what's going on. Younger partisans tend to be a little bit less committed to the party. They tend to not be as on it. But also what we might be seeing here, well, I don't want to speculate too much. I mean, it could be related to that. It could be related to they're just not following the news as much. Like as we showed earlier, they're not following it. And it could be that they just don't want to give higher ratings because they're like, well, I'm not paying attention and I can't say they've been doing excellent because I can't say that I'm doing good. It could be something like that. It could be, and I should stop speculating. We haven't looked at it yet. But it is something this graphic, when we first made it, it really just jumped off the page, like that different, because often when we get new data, we say, let's look at it this way, let's look at it this way, let's look at it, we make plans, and then somebody makes graphics. And I actually personally made this, not this graphic, a graphic designer made this all pretty for us. But I ran these numbers and put them up there, and it just was like, we got to write about this, because this is something really interesting that's going on. And we plan on looking at it further as we go on. There's another, our blog at the Pew Research Center. I'm going to give another plug for our research. I'm a big fan of everything we do. One of my colleagues wrote us, it came out late last week on our blog called The Fact Tank. He looked at these age differences on other questions, and it emerges there as well. It's not just the media that older versus younger people are taking different stances. And if I remember correctly in that data, it's not always young Democrats. There are a few questions there where it's the young Republicans who are different from the older Republicans. So we plan on studying this in depth moving forward. This is just starting. COVID is just getting going. We've got a lot we want to ask. And age has already stood out as something that's very interesting, that how people are experiencing it. And I just spent a bunch of time telling you about partisan polarization on the last slide. This shows that age is kind of breaking that a little bit, because there's only an 11-point gap between the young Republicans and young Democrats, where it's over 60 points among the oldest. That's very, very interesting. If that holds, we're going to look at it, because potentially as more news comes in, Democrats, fall in line and start shifting their opinions to match the rest of the party, or do they stay there? We're going to be studying that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So it looks like the COVID-19 story will be stimulating a lot of debate along with research and curiosity in the coming days. Well, let's hope that we will get together on another occasion talking about what post-COVID world looks like, having left it behind. We thank you very much to Baxter Oliphant for these very interesting insights and explanation, the in-depth elaboration on it. And thanks to our audience for their interest. We look forward to meeting on our next coffee night event on Wednesday evening, and wish everyone best of health. So please join me in expressing our gratitude to Baxter. Thank you very much, Baxter.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for joining.